Good evening, visitors, and welcome to the Australian War Memorial's last post ceremony, which today commemorates the 75th anniversary of the sinking of the Rakuyo Maru. My name is Greg Kimball, and joining us today from the Royal Australian Air Force is Wing Commander Murray Johnson. 75 years ago, on the 12th of September 1944, two Japanese ships transporting prisoners of war from Singapore to Japan were sunk, resulting in the loss of more than 1,500 Australian and British lives. The Japanese transported prisoners of war great distances across the empire, but the most dangerous period in a prisoner's life was travelling while in captivity. Conditions on board ships were severe. More than 1,000 prisoners may be crammed into spaces suitable for a few hundred, and given little food, fresh water, or adequate sanitation facilities. The prisoners of war called these ships hell ships. The Rakuyo Maru, with 1,318 Australian and British prisoners of war aboard, and the Kachidoko Maru, carrying 900 British prisoners of war, were part of a convoy that left Singapore for Japan on the 6th of September 1944. The prisoners were survivors of the Burma-Thailand Railway who had recently returned to Singapore. On the morning of the 12th of September 1944, the convoy was attacked by American submarines in the South China Sea. Rakuyo Maru was sunk by USS Sea Lion II and Kachidoko Maru by USS Pampanito. Prisoners not rescued perished at sea. More than 1,500 prisoners of war were killed in the incident. Some 22,000 Allied prisoners of the Japanese died in hell ship disasters, 19,000 of them as a result of friendly fire incidents. More Allied prisoners of war were lost on the hell ships than died on the Burma-Thailand Railway. In the largest of these disasters, 6,520 prisoners, mostly Indonesian labourers, were killed when the Junyo Maru was sunk on the 18th of September 1944. Today we remember those who died following the sinking of the Rakuyo Maru and the Kachidoko Maru. We pay our respects to the men and women commemorated here on the Roll of Honour and to the survivors who returned home. We warmly welcome the family of David Charles Cripps, whose story will be told shortly. Private Cripps is one of those killed as a result of the sinking of the Rakuyo Maru. We welcome the veterans who have served, those that are still serving, and the families that love and support them. We acknowledge the members of RSL and Services Clubs Association, RSL Victoria and RSL Queensland, who are watching the broadcasts of this ceremony across Australia. During this evening's ceremony, wreaths will be laid at the base of the Pool of Reflection by family, visitors and students on behalf of the following schools. From New South Wales, Currumbina School, Lane Cove, and Our Lady of Rosemary Primary School, Wyoming, and from Victoria, Gilson College, Taylors Hill campus. If you're able, please stand and join in singing the National Anthem.
Golden soil and well for toil,
Students, you may be seated. The Australian War Memorial was the vision of Charles Bean, Australia's first World War official historian. Bean landed with the Australian troops on Gallipoli and stayed with them at the front through to the end of the war. The idea of this national memorial and museum came to him at Pozières, France, in the depths of the bloody fighting of 1916. Bean's idea was that this would be a place where families and friends could mourn loved ones buried in faraway places. It would also be a place that could help all Australians understand what these men and women had endured and what they had done for us. Bean's vision, to which we remain true, is best expressed as inscribed in the entrance to the memorial's galleries. Here is their spirit, in the heart of the land they loved, and here we guard the record which they themselves made. Tonight we'll read the story behind just one of those on the Roll of Honour, which lists the names of more than 102,000 men and women who have given their lives for us in war and operations for more than a century. But first we present a lament, Flowers of the Forest. Wreaths of floral tributes will now be laid at the base of the pool of reflection.
Today we remember and pay tribute to Private David Charles Cripps. David Cripps was born in Geraldton, Western Australia, on the 15th of December 1921, the son of David and Mary Cripps. His father was a farmer who had enlisted for service in the First World War, but was given a medical discharge after suffering from chronic dermatitis. The elder David Cripps died when David was just 3 years old. His mother later remarried, but had no more children. Young David Cripps grew up in Northampton, where he attended school at Bowes. On the 13th of August 1941, at the age of 19, David Cripps enlisted for service in the 2nd Australian Imperial Force. Soon after joining his training unit, he developed laryngitis. After a week of recovery, he was back in training. In early October, he was allotted to reinforcements to the 2nd 4th Machine Gun Battalion. Largely consisting of men from Western Australia, the battalion had been established to provide direct fire support to infantry brigades of the 8th Division. After taking the journey to Darwin, where his battalion was undertaking garrison duties following the Japanese landings in Malaya, Private Cripps embarked for overseas service on the 30th of December 1941. Following a Japanese attack on Rabaul, the convoy carrying Cripps and his battalion turned and sailed to Sydney, and then Fremantle, finally reaching Singapore at the end of January 1942. Here it was hastily deployed in support of the 22nd and 27th Brigades in the northwest of Singapore Island. Heavily engaged and outnumbered around the landing beaches, over the course of the week it was pushed back towards the city. After days of air raids, the Japanese attacked Singapore on the 8th of February, crossing the Johor Strait and attacking along the 22nd Brigade's front and the 27th Brigade near the causeway. The machine gunners suffered heavily. In early February, 137 men were listed as killed or missing, 106 wounded, and 24 described as having shell shock. These casualties constituted almost 1/3 of the battalion. Despite this, the battalion kept fighting, sending out patrols until receiving the order to surrender. Despite orders to surrender weapons and ammunition, the men destroyed the majority of their equipment before being marched to Changi Jail. Cripps was one of 3,000 men who were part of A-Force, the first Australian group to leave Singapore for Burma. After sailing in the Rakuyo Maru on the 15th of May, a third of A-Force disembarked at Victoria Point in the far south of Burma. Another third was sent to Magui and the remainder to Tavoy, all tasked with building airfields. At first, the conditions for prisoners were adequate, if basic. Japanese control was fairly lax and a relatively good working relationship with the Japanese was established. Despite this, prisoners who attempted to escape were executed without trial. In September 1942, the Australian prisoners were consolidated at Tanbai Yuzat to begin work on the Burmese end of the Burma-Thailand Railway. As work went on, conditions for prisoners became worse. Without adequate food and medical supplies, many were falling ill. Their condition worsened in 1943 as cholera, smallpox, dysentery and malaria broke out and malnutrition became endemic. Relentless labour on inadequate rations in a deadly tropical environment caused huge losses. By the time the railway was completed in October 1943, at least 2,815 Australians, over 11,000 other Allied prisoners, and perhaps 75,000 other forced labourers were dead. After the railway was finally completed in October 1943, Cripps and the other surviving prisoners were gradually returned to Singapore. While the suffering and deprivations of the Burma-Thailand Railway are well known, the most dangerous period in a prisoner's life was travelling in captivity. Overcrowding, sickness, disease, and the dangers posed by Allied submarines caused stress and anxiety. Conditions on board ships were severe. Over 1,000 prisoners might be crammed into spaces suitable for a few hundred and given little food, fresh water, or adequate sanitation facilities. The prisoners of war called these transports hell ships. On the 6th of September, David Cripps was among 1,318 Australian and British prisoners of war assembled on the hell ship Rakuyo Maru, which was part of a convoy bound for Japan. On the morning of the 12th of September, the convoy was attacked by American submarines in the South China Sea. Rakuyo Maru was sunk by USS Sea Lion II. Kachidoki Maru, carrying British prisoners of war, was hit by USS Pampanito. Prisoners able to escape the ships spent the following days in life rafts or clinging to wreckage in open water. About 150 Australian and British survivors were rescued by American submarines. A further 500 were picked up by Japanese destroyers and continued the journey to Japan. David Cripps was one of 1,559 Australian and British prisoners of war killed in the incident. He was 22 years old. With no grave but the sea, today his name appears on the Luan Memorial, which commemorates over 2,000 men who died whilst prisoners of war and who have no known grave. His name is listed on the Roll of Honour on my left, among almost 40,000 Australians who died while serving in the Second World War. His photograph is displayed today beside the pool of reflection. This is but one of many stories of service and sacrifice told here at the Australian War Memorial. We now remember Private David Charles Cripps, who gave his life for us, for our freedoms, and in the hope of a better world.
Please stand for the reading of the Ode and the sounding of the last post.
They shall grow not old, as we who are left grow old. Age shall not weary them, nor the years condemn. At the going down of the sun, and in the morning, we will remember them.
We will remember them.
lest we forget.
lest we forget. We leave you this evening with the words of the memorial's founder, Charles Bean. Many a man lying out there at Pozières or in the low scrub at Gallipoli with his poor, tired senses barely working through the fever of his brain, has thought in his last moments, well, it's over. But in Australia, they'll be proud of this. Ladies and gentlemen, girls and boys, that concludes the last post ceremony. We thank you for visiting the Australian War Memorial and wish you all a pleasant evening.